Welcome to IT Instructor. Thank you for joining me. This channel is for IT beginners or intermediates that want to expand on their skill set. I will be doing various video tutorials for Windows Desktop, Windows Server, networking, and some software applications. This particular tutorial is on installing Windows Server 2022 or really any previous server, as they're all similar. If you've never installed Windows Server before, then you should find this helpful. I'll be using a Type 2 hypervisor for this demonstration. However, you could install Windows Server directly on new hardware or in really any virtual environment. This is not meant to provide expert advice, but rather to get you up and running with Windows Server and creating a domain controller as quickly and as simply as possible. If you would like to follow along, you'll need an ISO image of Windows Server, a hypervisor, and some sort of domain name in mind. That's it. Let's get started. I've pointed my hypervisor to the ISO image and given it about 8 gigs of RAM as well as a number of CPUs, and then I started the boot process, as you can see. So at this stage, we want to make sure that we choose the correct type of install that we want. Standard is most likely the kind of server you're going to be installing. Unless you're running a data center or in a large data center, you don't need that. So you don't want to install those extra features. Now it comes down to, do you need regular standard or do you need standard with the desktop experience? So we want to install Windows Standard with a desktop experience. The reason for that is we want, in this particular demo, the GUI, we want to be able to log into it and manage it just like we would with a desktop version of Windows. This version without the desktop experience doesn't give us any GUI, so it is designed to be remotely managed, and you do have a command prompt that gives you some limited abilities, but it's really designed to be installed or managed remotely. So we're going to go ahead and choose Windows Standard Desktop Experience. At this stage, it's taking your ISO image and decompressing the files and dropping them into the new C drive that you've created. Okay, you can see this is the first time Windows is actually booting on your hard drive or on your virtual hard drive. And it is actually starting the boot process, making sure that the files are there, setting up the original authentication, and we should have a desktop shortly. So it's rebooted once already. It just did the initial setup. That's actually normal. In this install, it's going to be installing VMware tools, which just lets the virtualization, the hypervisor, talk to the operating system as if it were on real hardware. And this all happens automatically. I don't have to touch anything. It's just installing the VMware tools. Alright, you can see I now have a desktop. The first thing that Windows Server does is it pulls up the server manager. Now I don't want to see this window all the time, so I'm going to say don't show this message again. And you'll notice that some things are red and some things are green. That's okay at the moment. Just make sure that the server is fully booted, because you'll see colored bars scrolling across the top while the operating system is still booting. So it's setting up a virtual adapter, Bluetooth adapter. That's fine. And that's just because it's looking at my host computer. So what we want to do is right away, before we make any decisions or make any changes, is we want to get Windows updates, because there may be problems with the particular edition you're running. There may be issues that Microsoft has fixed. So we just advisable to do Windows updates as the very first thing you do before you make any changes. So we want to go into Windows settings, update and security. It always says this first, no updates. Well, you just check for updates and it will find some. So right away you can see it's found a whole bunch of updates for me. Now you'll probably have to do this twice, but you should do it at least once before we proceed with any kind of configuration changes, simply because Windows may have fixed errors or bugs along the way, and you want to get those. You want to get the most current version of Windows up and running before you start making changes. As you can see, I've sped up the video. You really want to make sure that you've got the cumulative update installed. That's the most important thing here. Now, it could take quite a long time to do the updates, and it could take quite a long time to do the initial boot. Alright, we are back at the desktop after a Windows update. I'm just going to let it finish booting. You can see the bar on the top moving across, letting you know it's still at the booting process. You'll notice that there's some red down here. We'd like to see some green before we do anything else. Okay, it looks like the boot process is finished. We've got our green file and storage services running. That's good. Now, the next step is really we need to log in as the network administrator, or in this case it's right now it's the local administrator account. It has to have a password before we can make major changes to this particular server. So we're going to set up a password for the local administrator. To do that, click on Start, and we want to log out of this account. And then if we hit Control-Delete, we'll notice that there is a account that I used to install the operating system, and there is an administrator account. Now, currently this is the local administrator account, but it gets converted to the domain administrator account once you've made a domain. So it's very important that that you set a password for this. You have to set a password for local administrator. So we're going to sign in. Initially, there is no password, so it's just going to make a desktop profile for this account. That's fine. And we're going to go into Start, Settings, and User Accounts. Then we're going to go to Sign In Options, and we want to assign a complex password for the administrator. So we'll go down here and add a password. Notice that it does not have an old password because it's currently blank. So make sure that you type in your password twice. And then give it a hint that just in case you forget the administrator account, that you kind of remind yourself, but don't make it too obvious. The administrator's account is not an account you will be using on a regular basis. You're going to be using your own account or a secondary account of some sort, but you will not be using this administrator account. It's more like a fallback in case something goes wrong with your other accounts. You have the domain administrator account to fall back on. So great. So I've got a password set to my local admin, and we're just going to log out and make sure that that account password is working before we do anything else, because if we don't remember the password, if it's not working and we do all that work and we can't get back into a server, then that's a lot of time wasted. So we've got to make sure that this account password is correct. Okay, for me it's correct. I'm in as the local administrator. I've got my Windows updates done. Now I need to change the computer name. So right now it's got a default computer name. So we want to go to local server here, and when we do that, it gives us a number of important information here about this particular local server. It's currently not in a domain, it's in a work group, and it's got a default computer name. So it's this weird randomly generated computer name, which is not really appropriate if we're making a domain name. Now we really want to set something that makes sense to you or sense to the environment, the organization that you're setting this up for. So we really want to change the computer name. We're not changing the computer description, although you can do that, but that doesn't change what the server is. It only is descriptive. It's not really helpful. So we want to go here and change the computer name. Now, do not change the name and the domain at the same time. So we just want to change the computer name to, say, compserve01. Sometimes it's helpful to add 01 because you might have 10 servers, and you can number your servers or you can name them, and you can be creative. It doesn't really matter, but it should be appropriate to the environment you're in. Okay, I'm going to click OK. And it's going to immediately want you to reboot. That's a good thing. We'll restart now. Now you've got to be careful after your reboot, because Windows automatically just logged me in as my username and not as the local administrator. So that's going to be a bit of a problem. So we want to make sure that we're not logged in as the name you use to install, but we want to log out and sign in as the local administrator. Go back to here, and we're back in as local admin. Wait for the boot process to complete. Go into local server. We should now see the computer name has changed, so that's good. Now, this part is optional, but I recommend it for the process of installation. Now, you don't want to turn this off on a production server, but I do want to turn this off during the process of installing everything, making sure everything's up and running, because I may want to use a browser, and I don't want the hassle of security during the installation process. So I recommend you turn off the IE enhanced security. Then so that's not a requirement, but a recommendation. What is a requirement is this server must have a static IP address. You'll notice that I currently have a DHCP or automatically assigned IP address, and that is not acceptable for a domain controller. It's fine if you're going to have member servers, but certainly not for a domain controller. So we want to click on this, and that brings up our network connections. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration, we want the static IP to be the same IP address as the IP that DHCP offered it. So what we're going to do is record that in Notepad. So we'll just bring up a Notepad so that we can remember what these settings are here. So we're going to right click on our network adapter, click on properties, and we're not concerned about anything except for IPv4, this one here. So we can double click on it, or you can click on it and click properties, and you'll notice it's set set to automatic. Now we're going to set it to manual, but before we set it to manual, we need to record the current settings into our Notepad. So the quickest, easiest way is just to use a command prompt and type in ipconfig/all. Now there's a number of different ways of getting the IP address, so you can use the way that's preferable to you, but I just find this is quick and easy. So our current IPv4 address is 192.168.3.134. 192.168.3 and 134. Now the subnet mask is just the default class C, so I don't need to record that. But we do need the default gateway, which is 3.2. So we're going to go 192.168.3.2 as our gateway. And we want to know what the DNS server is. So the DNS is the same as the gateway. So we can go 3.2 is the DNS as well. Great. So we can close the command prompt now and go back to our IPv4 properties. Now we'll want to set that to be exactly the same as my Notepad. So this 192.168.3.134. Hit tab. Tab automatically fills the subnet mask of class C, which is 255.255.255.0. And the gateway, we want 3.2, which is what we have here. Then our DNS server, 192.168.3.2, and we're going to set a alternate one, which is a DNS server out in the internet. We're just going to use Google's 8.8.8.8. Now, this is not our final setting. We ultimately want this set to a loopback, so we want the server to use its own DNS server, but we're not there yet, so we're just getting a static IP address set, so this will work fine. So hit close. We don't need this window anymore. We don't need the Notepad anymore. We can close that and not save. And what we want to do is just refresh this. And hopefully on your setup, you now have a static IP setup. You can leave IPv6 enabled, that's fine. We're not going to be using that for now. You can see the IE enhanced security is off. And right now, it might be a good time just to test to see if you can browse the internet. And inside of Edge, we just might want to do speed test to see if it works, and I get a screen. That's great. I'm not going to actually do a speed test at the moment, but at least we can browse and we can see that we've got it. This might be a good time to also download your alternate browsers, whether you're using Chrome or Firefox or whatever browser you want to use. That would be a good time to just download and have your extra browser. Okay, now we're at the stage where we can start adding things into, or features into, the domain to create the domain. So we want to go back to dashboard, and we want to add a role and feature. Now this page doesn't really help me very much. It just tells us things that we already know. So I'm going to say skip this so that we don't see the beginning screen every time. Then we'll say next. And right now I want to install Active Directory domain services. So we're going to leave it at the default. It's just saying which server would you like to do that. If you had multiple servers, they would show up here, but we just have this server. Now here is the important part. Which role do you want to choose? Well, the very first role on any environment is to choose the Active Directory domain services. I'm going to click on that, and you'll see that it has other services it needs to run to make it function. So all that's good. We don't want to change anything here. I don't think you can actually, and we'll just add features. Then click next, and at this stage we're not going to select any additional features, and then it's talking about domain services, and then it talks about what we're going to do, just a confirmation. So we'll say install. I'm not going to say restart because there's an additional step that we have to take. Now this stage doesn't actually take very long. It's not like the other stages that are very, very long, very time consuming. This should only take a few seconds, less than a minute. And you'll notice that I can close this window right away if I want to, because up here there's this flag that we're going to be getting to. But I would just like to make sure that it's going to finish the install of the feature. All this does is it installs the ability, but it doesn't do any configuration of the domain. So that step is that step comes next. Okay, looks like we're done. Now you'll notice a big yellow exclamation mark up here. That's crucial. So it's the post-deployment configuration. So we want to promote this server to a domain controller. Here we want to add this create a domain. Now the very first time you create a domain, you're going to need a forest, which is a collection of domains. If you don't have any domains, then you need to create a forest. So in this case, I'm going to use the same name as I would the domain, the initial domain. The prefix always needs to be .local at this stage. So we want a domain name with a .local. Just takes a few seconds. Here we're looking at the functional level. Now, if you have an existing environment and you're creating a domain controller for an existing data center, then you may need to reduce the functional level depending on what servers you've got. If you're starting off, you want to use the highest level here because it gives you the most features. So if you use a lower functional level, you'll have less features but more compatibility. So for this purpose of this thing is I do not need server 2008 compatibility or server 2012 compatibility or server 26 compatibility. I can just leave it at the highest level for both of these. Now this is a special password that you sort of write it down and you put it in an envelope or you store it away somewhere safe. It is very rarely used, but in case of emergencies and you need to restore the directory services, then you need this password. So some network administrators will use the same password as the local administrator account. That's not a great idea, but you can do that if you're in a small environment. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just going to make sure that I use the same password. But whatever you do, don't lose that password. You don't use it to log in. You don't use it for user accounts. You only use it to do a disaster recovery. Okay. We are at the delegation for DNS. At this stage, we're not going to do that yet. Well, we will in the future. So we're not going to create a DNS delegation. We're just going to click next. Here is the NetBIOS name. It's an old 16-character domain name that we used with Windows NT and Windows 2000, and we keep it around because when you browse a local network with your file browser, this is the domain name that you see. You don't see .local, you see this name, and that's fine. So we don't want to add .local, we don't want to make any changes to that, just leave your NetBIOS name the same. If you have a really long domain name, you might notice that this is cut short because this cannot be more than 16 characters. The file locations are totally up to you. Now it's good to have a secondary hard drive, maybe a D drive or an E drive, to store your logs in sysvol folders. Now the reason for that is as the server ages and the log files grow and grow and grow, it could fill up your C drive. And if you have a full C drive, your server won't boot. So you could have a big problem in the future. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm not going to change it. I'm just going to leave it as C, but it is something to think about if you are going to be using this server long term. If you think, hey, this server could be around for 10 years. It also might be if you have a small hard drive, but if you have a really large hard drive, if you're installing this on a 4 terabyte drive, then it's not likely you're going to fill up the log file server, the log files on this hard drive. So totally up to you what you want to do there. Just be mindful that the logs grow. All right, just reviewing, you can see that it's just all the stuff that we've configured. Now it's going to do a prerequisite check to make sure that, one, I've got my local admin password set. It's going to make sure I've got a static IP address, and it's going to make sure that I've got a DNS server, or this is only a warning that we don't have to delegate the DNS server at this stage. So everything looks good. It says all prerequisite checks passed successfully. So we're good to go. Click install. You can see the progress bar on the top. It's kind of faint. They could have done a little better job on making this more obvious. And you'll notice all the buttons here are grayed out well in this process. So I can't click next or previous or install or cancel. This process has to complete once it's started. And you'll notice that once it's finished, it just automatically reboots the server. You will notice that it takes longer to boot this time. The server is changing a number of file structures and number of settings, so a lot of changes are happening in the background here, so it's normal for it to take quite a bit longer to boot this time. Okay, we've got a desktop again. Now we have a domain. So I'm just going to see that I'm logged in as the user account that I initially created it with. which is again not what I want. I want to be logging in as the local administrator. So if it's set to that, that's great. If it's not, then you want to make sure that you're logged in as the local admin. Notice that it doesn't show the administrator account here. We're now on a domain, and the domain is called IT Structure. So we want to make sure that we log in as administrator on that domain. Make sure you spell administrator correctly. That's a common problem with the first-time users. Okay, now I am logged in as administrator, but I'm not logged in as local administrator anymore. From now on, there is no local administrator. That account no longer exists. I am now what is called the domain administrator. So let's look at the local server settings. We can see that the computer name is good. The domain name is now a .local, which is great. You can see that I still have a static IP address. Everything looks great. Now you'll notice on the left hand side that there are two new features installed. So that is Active Directory Domain Services, which is the one we installed, and it also requires DNS to run. So by default, when we added this as a domain controller, DNS has to be installed. So that's for sure. Now we also need to set up our DNS to point to an outside IP address so that it contains the correct DNS information. Currently, the server is looking at the outside DNS server instead of its own DNS. So why do we need DNS? Well, we need DNS internally so that all the names can be resolved within our own network. That's why we need an internal DNS server, but we need an external DNS server to tell us everything on the internet. So the internet DNS get pulled into our own DNS, and then our own DNS is also used to resolve names within our local network. The last thing I would recommend that you do is Windows updates one more time, because you've made changes to it and you want to make sure that everything is up to date and working. So you'll notice right away, even though I did Windows updates before the install, it's got more Windows updates. So you just want to stay on top of that in case there's any bugs, any antivirus that you need to update. We want this server working perfectly, so make sure that your Windows updates are good. Now, in this case, we don't have to reboot. That's great. It's checked. So we can close that. One thing though, we don't want this console coming up every single time we log into the server. Maybe you do, but for me, I don't like this coming up every time I log in. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on Manage, Server Properties, and don't start the server manager automatically. We can pull this up anytime we want, but when we log in, we want to see the desktop. So we're just going to close that, and really we want to be greeted with this every time we log in. So we can click on here, and now we can see that there is a new folder called Windows Administration Tools. These are essential tools to get you managing your new network, your new environment. Now the most valuable, the most common tool that you will be using here is actually Active Directory Users and Computers. So you want to click on that, maximize it, and we want to double click on the domain name, and we want to see the OUs here. Now, I'm going to go through this on another video, so stay tuned for my next video on talking about Active Directory users and computers. Thanks for watching.